We're continuing in Mitzvah Hashem our study of the laws of tzli as they replace the requirement of malicha, and that the tzli, the process of roasting, when the fire will remove the dam, it draws the dam that's inside the basar, and therefore in tzli we can circumvent the requirement of malicha because there won't be any dam left in the basar. That's what the tzli accomplishes. However, there are situations in which it's not clear at all whether or not the tzli will replace the malicha. And the cases that we're about to study today fit into one of two categories. Either the meat that we're subjecting to tzli looks very red, and what we believe is that perhaps the animal during its lifetime received some sort of a blow, a makkah, and as a result, the dam was poresh. It left the vridim, the various vessels and arteries, and it coagulated in one place. And that's why the meat looks very red. Now, we have halacha with regard to dam of dam sheparash. If the dam left its original place, it's no longer in its original place, like for example, in the case of a makkah, then that's called dam d'oraisa. If the dam, on the other hand, remains bolua and it never is poresh, that's not dam. Again, it might have, in a rabbinic context, various categories of dam, but it's not the real dam that the Torah prohibits. That's called dam shapirish. So the first issue that we're going to cover is going to be whether tzli can be a substitute for malicha, circumventing, as it were, the need for malicha in a case where there's dam nitzrar. Nitzrar means it's coagulated in one place. It means it left the circulatory system as a result, apparently, of a makkah. And now the question is, since we're dealing with dam sheparash, which is the real McCoy dam, and the meat looks so red, it has that reddish color, is it reliable to assume that that dam that's nitzrar will be removed through the process of tzli without a serious malicha? And if we need a serious malicha, then we might require cutting incisions into the meat and then adding a significant amount of salt in order to remove that dam. Another issue that's going to come up is what's called the moel, or what we call rotev. And that means that sometimes they used to soak the meat in, let's say, vinegar, for example, and the juices of the meat would exude in and get mixed up in this chometz. So the chometz now has a certain, shall we call it, concentration of dam, such that the dam is not butter. And even if we subjected the meat to tzli, but if afterwards the meat still has some residue of dam, and I soak the meat, as apparently was custom, in vinegar, the juices, the rotev of the meat, which the Gemara calls moel mem vav hey lamed, exudes and penetrates into this chometz, into this vinegar. The vinegar now has a very serious concentration of dam in it. These are some of the cases that we're going to deal with now. So let's see the nusach of the Gemara itself. So we're on Daf Ayin Dalid Amud Beis. I would say about half or maybe 2/3 down the Amud. And we're up to a line that begins with a Hilchasa. Towards the end of that line, Hai Umtza. And if you have any trouble finding it, you'll take a look at Tosfos Divrei Maskil Asmik. And if you go up about 3 lines above that Tosfos, you'll see the Hilchasa. Hi umta di asmik. We have now a slice of meat. Asmik means it's red, and we assume that the reason why there's a reddish color in the meat is because it's dam shenitzrar. Nitzrar means, as we said before, there's a concentration of coagulated dam as a result of a maka or for some other reason. And in this case, this is a serious problem of dam. Why? Because dam evarim, the dam that's inside the various organs of the animal, is mutter, even though it's dam. Kolzman shelo piresh, as long as it hasn't been removed from its arteries inside the organ. So if it wasn't parish lechutz, then it's not dam. However, in this case, that the umta, the meat, is very reddish, we assume that there's a concentration of dam in one place. How did that happen? It must have happened as a result of some maka or perhaps some sort of disease of the animal, but the animal is not, this is not normal functioning blood that you would call dam haivarim. This is already dam shapirich. Such dam is awesome. And therefore, we're going to require, let me say it a different way, we're not going to rely on sli, the process of roasting over a fire, which normally would remove the dam, is not going to operate and achieve our goal of removing this dam shenitzrar in the case of asmik. So what do? What are your options? Number one, your first option is chatche umalche. Now, what does chatche obviously means to cut it up? And the Rishonim, Rashi, the Rashba, they assume that he's got to cut it in many different places and add salt, malicha. This is what we call malicha gemura, right? The ultimate malicha means that you cut it up in many places and you put salt. And again, just to quote the Rashba here, the Rashba writes, since the dam is coagulated in one place, Havi damach masmako v'piresh mimkomo v'asur, and therefore says the Rashba, Yichatchenu v'yase dam lidam Pesach, you're making openings by these incisions so that the dam could come out. That's the ultimate way of preparing this umtza diismik through a process of malicha. Once that process of malicha in its ideal form was implemented, then there's no dam left as far as we're concerned. And therefore you can take this piece of meat and you don't even have to roast it. You could cook it the normal way you cook meat. Afilu l'kdera shari mutal levashla. He doesn't need to roast it. Now we have a second option, shafte bishapuda. After he salted it, he can place it on a spit and he can now roast it with a fire and he's allowed to eat it. Now, the question is, when the Gemara adds shafte bishapuda, does that mean that he doesn't have to cut it up and salt it, and this becomes an alternative, and he can eat it and rely on the shipud, on the tzli, even without chatche umalche. In other words, how do I read the Gemara? This is going to be a subject that we have to investigate. It says, "Hi umtza di asmik chatche umalche afilu k'deir shari." Now it says shari a second time. Shafte bishapuda shari. It sounds like shafte shapude will substitute for the process of chituch and malicha. And if that be the case, then we're coming to a conclusion then, which again the poskim are going to deal with, that even though we started with a piece of meat that has a particular color of red to it, we can still be matir it without malicha through tzli. And the reason why that becomes very relevant to the next line in the Gemara is because now the Gemara is going to present a machlokes between Rav Acha and Ravina. That's what we discussed yesterday, that sometimes we don't know who's the Mekil and who's the Machmir. We always assume that Ravina is the Mekil with three exceptions. And the first exception that we mentioned on the list yesterday was Umtza. And where and when is Ravina going to be Machmir? And the answer is Umtza diasmik, a piece of meat that was red. And as we said before, we assume there's Dam Sheparesh. Achte agumre. Instead of roasting it over an open fire, he placed the meat on top of coals. Later on, the Gemara is going to discuss whether these coals are red hot, and producing flame, and they're getting more and more intense, or even amamos, which means even if the coals are in a decreasing, the heat is going down. But let's assume that we're talking about red hot coals. Pligi ba Rav Acha Ravina, chad osar v'chad shari. And mandi osar is Ravina. Why? Because Ravina holds that in order to effectively get rid of the dam, in this case of asmik, you have to have the meat suspended in midair over the fire. That's the tzli that could remove the dam, even in this case. But if the tzli is gechalim, the meat is resting directly on coals, it's not suspended in air, then Ravina is of the opinion that because there's a concentrate of dam shapiresh, the gechalim don't have that power to draw the blood out, and that's called mitzmis samis, which means somehow the meat, as a result of the cholim, shrivels. It's called mekuvats in Hebrew, or mitztamek, if you're familiar with that phrase from Parakira, mitztamek. And as a result, the blood becomes absorbed within the meat itself. And the process of grilling the meat on coals, according to Ravina, will not succeed in removing the dam. V'ein adam yotze. And although Ravina in general is mekil whenever he disagrees with Rav Acha, this is one of three exceptions. And as we'll soon see, all three exceptions are one and the same. And we're not going to rely on gechalim, which is called achte agumre. He places it down on these coals as a substitute for tzli. Now the implication is that if it would be a regular piece of meat that's not reddish in color, and we have no reason to believe that the dam is nitzrar, then even Ravina would agree that roasting on top of coals is a valid way of removing the dam and substituting for tzli itself. Umandat shari, Rav Acha in this case, who's the mekil, He says Mishav Shoiv. The exact opposite, that the Gecholim are not going to cause a situation of mitztamek where the dam becomes more bolua and trapped in the meat, but on the contrary, the Gecholim are going to draw the blood out and shoev es adam min abosar achutza. So it's not that the dam remains bolua as Ravina would have it, but Rav Acha holds it is shoev es adam hachutza. V'hilchasa mishav shoev. And we are going to rely on this process of gechol. Now, he says the following. I just want to read to you an important note here. He says, ordinarily, it is permitted to eat meat that was roasted on coals. This type of roasting is not as effective as roasting on a spit because it doesn't purge the blood as effectively. But that's no concern. Why? Because the Torah does not forbid the consumption of blood that exists naturally in meat in its original absorbed state. And it's not categorized as dam. And he sends you to the Aruch HaShulchan. So Bli Neder, please remind me. I want to go through the Aruch HaShulchan. He has a tremendous introduction to the laws of Malicha. He says, that which is deposited in arteries or vessels and departed from its original location where it's naturally absorbed, what we call dam sheparesh, is forbidden. Now, meat must be salted before we cook it, because otherwise the blood will be drawn out in the pot. In other words, the process of bishul is going to draw the blood out, and that becomes dam sheparesh. So you can't cook with meat in its natural state, because although the dam right now before the bishul is not osur, it's going to become osur because as a result of the bishul, the dam is now removed from its original place. Then, during the course of the bishul, the meat reabsorbs the dam, and now the dam is osur. However, when the meat is roasted, we have no concern, because what does roasting achieve? All the blood that is purged, meaning that exits, will be burnt by the Eish. And according to most Rishonim, he points out that she's supposed to, you don't even need any malicha whatsoever. Rashi holds you need a minimum of malicha. However, now we're dealing with the case of umtza de isma. The blood is deposited in one place, and it's not absorbed in the flesh, which we call dam evarim. So therefore, if there's any dam that remains after the roasting process, it's asur. And now we have the question whether roasting on coals will remove all the dam. So Rabbosai, could be that the machlok, again, I would have to ask my Rebbe this question, but it could be that the machlok between Rav Acha and Ravina about roasting on coals is not a mitzius. They're not arguing about whether the blood will be absorbed or whether it will be drawn out. They all agree that there's some gap, or shall I say discrepancy, in the downward motion between the original roasting on a spit and the case of coals, roasting on coals. Everybody agrees that some of the dam will remain behind. Ravina understands that that dam remains behind, undermines the entire enterprise of tzli in this case, because roasting on gecholim is not tzli. And Rav Acha says, no, whatever blood remains behind is insignificant. The Torah requires a Masechet tzli, and this is called a Masechet tzli. Later on, we're going to see that there's going to be a discussion based on our Mishnah about tzli in Korban Pesach. What happens if the korban itself, the lamb, is not suspended in midair, but rather you lay the lamb down on the coals? Is that called tzli or is it not? And the Gemara is going to say, we'll see later on, that there's an extra pasuk. It says tzli twice, and therefore it tells you that gecholim is not called tzli in Korban Pesach. But that's halacha in Korban Pesach. Universal definition of tzli would recognize even al gabi gecholim, so that Rav Acha operates within the category, we'll call it a conceptual category, as legally defined, called tzli. Roasting on gecholim, on coals, is tzli, and I don't have to worry about the dam that's still there, because the Torah says that we rely on tzli. And Ravina is saying, no, the Torah is not going to rely on tzli if the tzli is a secondary kind of tzli, and there's some measure or volume of dam that remains within the basar. And the only time we're worried about that, meaning the gap between roasting and coals, according to Ravina, is only in the case of ismik, where we see that there's a concentration of dam chenitzra. Now, this machlokes between Rav Acha and Ravina repeats itself 3 times. So the second time, and let's emphasize again that if instead of roasting this ismik, this umtzad ismik on coals, he cuts up the basar and put salt on it, that for sure, even according to Ravina, will do the job. And again, you might ask, in Mitzias, is that really so? You were able to purge all the dam that was nitzrar as a result of the makkah? I don't know. It could be the Ravina saying that the Torah recognizes malicha, and this is an act of malicha. All right. Second machlokas, v'chein beye. Right, we said these are the testicles of the animal, and again, they are very red. So, chaschinu umalchinu, the first option in order to get rid of this dam would be to cut it up and do a complete, total malicha. And then afilu l'kedei risharion, as we said before, you've done a malicha, and then you could cook it, and there's no issue. The malicha was meaningful, and it achieved the goal of removing the dam. Tolina b'shipuda, another alternative, he suspends it in mid-air with a spit, and as a result, even if he didn't cut it up, etc., the tzli, the fire, will draw forth the dam, and the Torah relies on that. Sharyam, made of dayav, and all the blood will exude. In Hebrew, it's called shoses. Let's just see how he translates the word shoses into English. Flows. Okay, fine. It flows. Now we get to the machlokes Rav Acha Ravina. Achtinu agumre. He roasted over coals. Pliba Rav Acha Ravina chad osar chachori mandi osar mitzmeis somis. Right. We said it's makavetz. It causes it to shrivel. Let's just see how he translates it. Shrivel. How do you like that? Okay. So the dam remains absorbed inside the flesh. Umandit shari Rav Acha is the matir here. He holds that even if you place the meat on top of coals, mishav, shoiv, it nevertheless removes the dam. A third machlokas v'chein mizraki. So we're talking about the arteries. And he says here, in the name of Rashi, and we'll see Rabbeinu Gershom seems to disagree, but we're talking about the arteries shebetzavar habehema, in the neck of the animal, the beis hashchita, vridim shebebeis hashchita, im gidim gedolim shebetzavar, vehem maleim dam. So these arteries are particularly laden, with dam, and we need a very excellent, uh, high quality, top quality method of removing the dam. Number one, chatche umalche, afilu k'dei shari. Number two, talia b'shapuda. He doesn't have to cut it up. Oh, but he adds another condition. Beis hashchita l'tatoi. We need an opening for the blood to come out of these arteries. And in that sense, we have to make sure that there's a downward motion in which the animal is turned upside down so that the Beis Hashchita is now facing downwards so that the blood from the arteries will go through the Beis Hashchita. And again, this makes sense if we're talking about the arteries that are in the neck of the animal, and the blood will flow out. And that's called Mediv diet. Oh, now we have the old machlokes on the third round of achte agumre. So he takes these arteries and he roasts them over coals. Is chad osar v'chad shori. Mandi osar, we said, was Ravina. He says mitzvahs tzomis. As we said before, the coals cause a certain kind of a shriveling, and the dam becomes nivla. And Mandi shori Ravacha is matir. He says mishav shoiv, that even the fire of coals of gecholim will mishav shoiv, will draw forth the blood, and the blood will come out. Ilchasa mishav shoiv. And we're going to paskin. That's what we discussed yesterday. That in a machlokas between Ravina and Rav Acha, we usually paskin like Ravina, except for these three exceptions where Ravina is not the mekil, but rather he is the mach. Hai umtza di asmik. Okay. Now we haven't discussed yet the question that I asked you before, but we're about to discuss that question of taking the meat after the tzli and soaking it in vinegar. So let's take a look at the next Gemara. Hai umtza di asmik. Again, we have a piece of meat that's red, and he roasted it. What happens after he roasts it? Chalye. Now, the Aramaic word chalye in Hebrew is mohel, but we'll soon see that Rashi suggests a different translation of the word chalye. But right now we're going with Rashi's first shot. Rashi offers two interpretations, and he says in his first interpretation that as a result of the tzli, there is gravy, moel, we call it rotev, that comes out of the meat when he slices the meat. Is asir. Now again, when we say asir, let us not forget that we're talking about umtza di asmik. We're not talking about regular meat. We're talking about meat that gives us an indication, because of its red color, that there is dam shenitzrar, which is the real dam sheporesh. And we came to the conclusion in the previous lines that we just learned that tzli is going to remove the dam. And if tzli removes the dam, and Ravina only argues against this in the case where he roasted over coals, but clearly if he roasted over a fire, even Ravina's on board, that is a way of getting rid of the dam. The dam will flow out as a result of the heat of the fire that draws the dam out. So why are we saying chalye asir? And the answer is because we're not talking about regular meat, we're talking about the asmik. Now, as a result of the asmik, then even though he does tzli, Rashi says, no sarbami at dam, this supports what I tried to suggest before, and we're going even according to Rav Acha now, that there is still some residue of dam even after the tzli, because again, the dam is very concentrated and coagulated in one place. So the tzli will remove most of the dam, but there's still some dam left. And therefore the moel, this gravy, these liquids like yotze min hachaticha, yesh bo dam. So it seems like Rashi is saying that whatever dam is left after the tzli, vis-a-vis the basar, it's batel. But if there's a liquid substance that comes out of the meat, which is called moel, that has a concentrated volume of dam that's mixed into that gravy, and it's not butter. So imagine, this is like, in my mind, this is a pella. I mean, again, I'm not a bucky in Hilchas Malicha, and certainly not in Hilchas Tzli, but this is a pella to me, that we're going to differentiate between the meat itself, which again, clearly, and even Ravina is on board, tzli, real tzli, will successfully remove the dam. So you basically, in effect, you have subjected the meat to malicha, because tzli is a substitute for malicha, and the dam comes out. But yet, when I cut this piece of meat and moel comes out, the gravy comes out, there's a concentrated dam. Again, only in this particular case, I can't overemphasize this. We're not talking about a regular piece of meat. We're talking about a piece of meat that clearly indicates that there was a makkah, is then the moel is us. That's Rashi's first explanation. And the Gemara goes on to say, lo asmik, if it's a regular piece of meat, it doesn't have redness, it's chalye shari, you can cut it up. And all the, gravies and oils and juices that come out of the meat are all mutter. That's what we have so far before Ravina. Now Rashi offers an alternative translation of the word chalye. Chalye does not refer to the gravy and the juices of the meat, but rather it refers to vinegar. And the Aramaic word for vinegar is challah, with an aleph at the end. Challah, says Rashi, is chometz. After he has roasted the piece of meat, this meat that has the red color to it, and he roasted it on an open fire on a spit, then he dips it and soaks it in vinegar. I'm guessing that that's part of what a chef would do. Now watch what happens here. Again, the physics of it is that somehow the chometz will draw forth the dam, but listen carefully, the asmik. And now the liquids that are soaking in this vinegar now take on a red color. So when I look at this, vinegary gravy, what I see is a red color. Shehedim achometz. Again, we have different types of vinegar. There's white vinegar, there's brownish vinegar. So I don't know exactly what color the vinegar was before he soaked the meat in the vinegar, but now the vinegar took on a red color. Ulefichach asur. That's Rashi's second interpretation. And Tosfos doesn't accept Rashi's second interpretation because Tosfos argues that if he did a complete sli and the meat itself is mutter, and we said that a complete sli, again, the cholim is questionable, but in the case of umta the asmik, if he did a full-fledged sliya on a spit, then it's mutter. He says, therefore, kevan shehi muteres v'tzola kol karcha kol tzarka, is im chatcha. He says even if he cuts it up, madui yoser hamoel hayotzi mimenu. V'im, says Tosas, lo tzola kol tzarka, if Rashi's talking about a Metzias where he didn't do a complete sli, is afi atzma tzricha lios asur. The meat itself should be prohibited. Obviously, if the meat is mutter, then the sliya was a complete sliya. If that be the case, then the moel inside the tzli is mutter as well. How could that moel become us? And the Gemara's language is chalia os. Mashma shachaticha atzma muteres, v'rak hamoel hayotzi mimenu os. So Tosas seems to be rejecting this concept that the tzli on the one hand could be matir the basar, and we're allowed to eat the meat, even though it was ismak, and yet the gravy of the meat could generate an isur. And again, it depends on the two pshatim of Rashi. Either the gravy that after he cuts the meat, you end up with gravy, or where he soaks the meat in vinegar, and the vinegar now changes its color. Tosas says this can't be, because you can't tell me that the meat itself is mutter and yet the moel is us. So Tosas here now quotes the Bahag. Now I'm just going to read the Bahag. I need more time to work on this Bahag because I want to go on in the Gemara, but the Bahag says that we're talking about raw meat that was placed in vinegar. Now, I don't know exactly how long the meat soaks in vinegar, but the dam itself, if the meat is left for a long period of time, I don't know exactly how long, Zman Meruba b'toch hachometz, inside the vinegar, such that now the vinegar changed its color, then we're going to assume that dam came out of this piece of meat and went into the chometz. And therefore the chaticha itself is also asura, because according to Tosas, l'shitaso, conceptually you can't separate between the meat and the chometz. Again, the Bahag had a different girsa in Agamara. According to his girsa, umtza the ismik hu v'cholya asur, that both the meat that turned red and the gravy that turned red, the vinegar that turned red, both are asur, because he left the meat for zman meruba, for an extended period of time, soaking in this chometz. However, im meinichol zman muat, if it was only soaking in vinegar for a short period of time, hadam shebechaticha, what does the vinegar accomplish? It creates a nitzmas. It kind of shrivels up the dam, v'lo niflan, and it won't come out. And therefore the chometz becomes mutter. V'chein hachaticha atzma, mishum shadam shebetocho hu dam evarim shelo pirish. So again, we're not talking about a case where the redness indicates that the meat had received some sort of makkah, but we're talking about basar chai. And if he takes basar chai, which is normal meat, and he soaks it in chometz, then if he doesn't keep it there too long, then what the chometz accomplishes is that the dam will not be polate, and the dam remains exactly where it was naturally, which is called dam hevarim shelo piresh, and it's mutter. But if he leaves it for a longer period of time soaking in chometz, and now the chometz changes its color, then we clearly see there's an indication clearly that the dam was yotzei min chaticha, and it ended up in the chometz. But now both the chaticha and the chometz are both asurim according to that gears of the Bahag. And the reason for that is because we never salted the dam, and the dam now is poresh as a result of a long-term soaking in vinegar. So the short-term soaking in vinegar is the exact opposite, according to Tosfos, of the long-term. Because in the case of the short period of time, man muat, what the vinegar accomplishes is it, so to speak, freezes the dam exactly where it is, and it becomes dam a varm shelo piresh. But if you leave it soaking in the vinegar for zman meruba, whatever that means, then Tosfos says the exact opposite occurs, and you see clearly in the chometz that it's changed its color, and the dam is now removed from the avarim, and that's going to generate an iser both in the chaticha and in the chometz in the vinegar. Again, we have Rashi who insists that we can differentiate between the basar itself and the moel, which means one of two things. Either he cuts up the meat and the gravy comes out, or he soaks the meat in vinegar and the vinegar is discolored and indicates that it is now has a very serious concentration of dam that is impacted on the color of the vinegar. And although the chaticha itself is mut because it was subjected to tzliya gemura, according to Rashi, right? Nevertheless, there's still pockets of dam, and those pockets of dam will generate an isur when they are removed from the meat. How did you remove them from the meat? Either because you slice the meat, that's Rashi's first interpretation, and there was a moel that came out of the meat, and that moel has an unusually high concentration of dam in it. The dam is not batil like it would be vis-a-vis the meat itself. Or he took the meat and he soaked it, according to Rashi's second shot, in vinegar, and the vinegar now changed its color because there's a very serious concentration of dam in the vinegar. But the meat itself, since it was subject to a tzliya gemura, says Rashi, is muteris, and that's based on Rashi's girsa that chalye asur, only the gravy or the vinegar is asur. However, in a regular case, according to Rav Acha at least, if the meat is not particularly red, and we don't believe that there's no reason to believe that there's any unusual concentration of dam, then all he needs is tzliya. The tzliya will be successful in removing any dam, and therefore chalye shari. The moel is mut. We're not going to believe that. Again, you have to ask yourself the question, so what is the redness of the gravy? That he doesn't tell you. He says, just 1 second, let me correct myself. He says, he says that if there's no redness, therefore we believe that there's no concentration of dam and chalye shari. I mean, you wonder what Ravina is going to say. Let's see Ravina. Ravina Omar afilu lo asmik, which means that he subjected the meat to tzliya, and now he's got chalye, whatever that means. Rashi's two interpretations. Is chalye us, even though it doesn't have a color of dam? And why is that so? Efshar de lesbe shuraiki de dam. So shiraiki are arteries, right? Gidin shel dam. Well, I don't know. He leaves us a little bit hanging over here. Just see exactly. He says here, Rav. Oh, so he's going to say that Ravina's lishitaso, right? We've seen Ravina being machbir. Oh, Ravina Osar. He's saying that he roasted it al gabi gecholim. I didn't see that. Just 1 second. How does he know that we're talking about gecholim? Right, so I have to fill in that missing blank. But he says Ravina follows his own stringent view presented above that roasting on coals does not purge all the blood, and hence a reddened piece of meat that was roasted on coals forbidden. Okay, fine, but here we're not talking about a reddened piece of meat. Here he states that even if an ordinary piece of meat, i.e., it's not reddened, is roasted on coals. Again, he's insisting that we're talking about coals, because otherwise the whole sugi makes no sense. I mean, again, I just wish I knew where he's quoting this from. The gravy that trickles out when he cuts the meat is forbidden. The meat itself is permitted because whatever blood remains inside is in its naturally absorbed state, right? In other words, it's not dam shepiresh. However, the gravy that trickles out contain traces of blood that are no longer absorbed in their natural location and are therefore prohibited. Wow. This is so scary. I mean, I don't know how if you're in the kitchen, I don't know how you're going to work this out according to Ravina. You subjected the meat to a secondary kind of a tzli, albeit it's not your first choice tzli. It's on gecholim, and you're allowed to eat the meat. But as soon as you cut the meat and the gravy comes out of the meat, that gravy has dam in it, which was poresh. So it's really interesting because the dam that remains before you cut up the meat, that's dam varm shel piresh, and that dam is mutter, so I can eat the meat. But as soon as I start cutting up the meat and the liquid gravy oozes from the meat, at that moment in time, I have dam shel piresh, and it is very heavily concentrated in the gravy. And the gravy that trickles contains blood that's no longer absorbed in their natural location, and therefore is prohibited. Now, that's all according to Rashi's Pirush Rishon, that the word achet, the word chalye, means gravy. According to Rashi's second explanation, when chalye means vinegar, he soaked it in vinegar. The vinegar in which the meat is soaked draws out the remaining traces of blood, and once again it becomes dam shepiresh, and therefore becomes prohibited. Wow. I mean, again, we're talking about low ismic now. At Bishlema in the Resha, we're talking about dam. You're talking about umtza, meat, the ismic. Okay, so now the halacha, again, according to Rashi, it still remains very complicated, in the engineering of it. What are you allowed to eat? What are you not allowed to eat? Can you cut it? Can you not cut it? The gravy comes out. It doesn't come out. But at least we can limit it to an unusual set of circumstances, which is called umtza the asmik. Now we're talking about umtza the low asmik, and Ravina says that as soon as you cut the meat, the gravy that comes out of the meat is awesome, whereas the meat itself is mutter. What are you going to do? You're going to put a little flag stuck into the meat with a toothpick that says, "Do not cut this meat." I don't get it. Amarle Mar Bar Amemer Rav Ashi. So now let's get the names straight over here. So we have a discussion here between Mar and Rav Ashi, but Mar is the son of Amema. So when he says Abba, the word Abba here refers to Amema. Megama legmue. You gave him the gravy from the meat, and he swallowed it. Again, we're talking about the second case, where there was a machlokus between Rav Ach and Ravina, namely the meat did not have a particular red color to it. It was normal meat, the low asmik. And clearly, Abba, who's a Meimar in this case, had no reservation eating the gravy. And Ika Diamir Rav Ashi Gufa Magamea Legmuit. Fine. Amalei Mar Bara Meimar Lirav Ashi. And now, what is the minhag in a case of soaking meat in vinegar? I mean, this is probably where Rashi got his second pirush from. Abba hai chala de cholit be charazimna sulo tani cholit be. If the vinegar was used on one occasion, to soak the meat, then we cannot use the same vinegar a second time around to soak the meat. In other words, what's going on here is that magical chemical power in physics of the vinegar, that the vinegar causes the dam to be clamped up, so to speak, to be incarcerated in the avarim. Hence, we don't have dam shapirech. You can only use that vinegar once. Buy yourself another volume of vinegar, but the first original volume loses its potency once it achieved its goal on the first round. So don't reuse the vinegar. Maishna mechala masmaha. What about vinegar? Let's say we can have more concentrated vinegar that's very potent. We could have weaker vinegar. And if we soak the meat in vinegar on the first round, how do you know that vinegar will achieve its goal and the dam will become bolua in the avarim? Maybe it's chala matmaha. It's weak vinegar. And we never found any differentiation. You don't need a hechsher on the vinegar that says this vinegar is potent enough to be used for soaking meat. We allow any vinegar. So the Gemara answers, Hasam, in the case of weak vinegar, which is called chala matmaha, Isa. Now we're going to turn to Daf Ayin Hey. Isa lekiyua de peri bienik. The vinegar has some element of the tam of the pri, which is chometz, which has a chamitzis to it, a certain, I guess, an acidy. Let me just see if he translates kiyua as acid. Give me a second. Oh, he calls it the kiyua as the strength of the fruit. All right. I guess instead of strength, maybe we could use the word sharpness. It has a sharp chemical substance, and therefore, if he soaks his meat in the original chometz, even if it's weaker, but nevertheless, it does have that koach, that potential, the potency of kiyua, the strength of the peri itself, and it will accomplish whatever it has to accomplish. But a hacha, here where he's using it a second time around, he already soaked the meat that was roasted in this vinegar once, lesser liqueur de peribein. So that chamitus, which I identify as acidity, if anyone has a better word for chametzus in this context, but the Hebrew translation says chametzus hapri. He just calls it in English the strength of the pri, but chametzus means more than just strength. It's a more specific adjective. Eno kayim od chometz. The chometz is already on the first round, used up its chametzus power to draw the blood or to cause the blood to be bolua, and therefore you cannot do a second chalita, meaning a soaking of a second piece of meat in the same vinegar. Now, we're going to end the shir in about 2 minutes. I just want to give an introduction to the next sugya, which is the sugya of askala. And askala is some sort of a grill. And the question is, can we achieve the mitzvah of tzli and Korban Pesach on a grill, not on a rotisserie, with a spit that suspends the meat in air. And the Mishnah says, "Ein solenas haPesach lo ala askela." And then the Mishnah goes on to say that even though that is so, but Ma'aser b'Rav Gamliel, Amar Rabbi Tzadik Ma'aser Gamliel, Shomer l'Tavi Avdot, say u tzlei lanu es haPesach ala askela. So the Gemara is going to immediately ask the question, Ma'aser listar. I mean, you just told me that ain't solenas haPesach ala askela, and now you tell me a story that Rabbi Gamliel told Tavi Avdo that he should roast the Korban Pesach on an askela. So the Gemara is going to now categorize 2 types of askelas. One askela where the fire is able to go through the askela. There are enough open spaces between the barzel of the different pieces of metal on this grill to allow the flame to shoot up and directly roast the meat of the lamb. And there's what's called an askela she'ena minukeves. It doesn't have these openings to allow the fire to go up. So that's a short sugya that Amir Hashem will finish in the first few minutes tomorrow. But the real sugya is bo minei Rav Chinina, etc., etc. And this is going to take us into the world of Arla, which is a sugya back on Daf Chavav here in Masechet Pesachim, where he took wood or klipos that have the Iser Arla, and he used it as fuel, and he baked his bread, whether or not we hold Yeshvach Eitz V'Pas, which means, do we see, of course, Arla is also Bana, that he's benefiting directly from the heat that is produced by burning the Arla, and whether or not we would have a problem then to roast the Korban Pesach on Klipe Arla. And we'll see tomorrow that the Gemara is going to distinguish between Goraf and Lo Goraf, meaning, are there really pieces left of the Klipe Arla, like the coal that's producing the fire, or Goraf? There's only heat in the oven that was generated by the burning of the Arla, but right now there's no Arla be'en inside the oven. So that will be, Emir Hashem, our discussion for tomorrow. Okay, then. Wish everyone a great day, and thank you so much.